So today we're talking about consciousness. Is the brain the creator of consciousness or the receiver? Sometimes it's said that the brain, the receiver of consciousness or the reduced consciousness. Do you understand what the word reducer would mean here?
Maybe not.
I'm just speculating what it means because that's just so obvious to me. But consciousness exists separate from the brain. Then the brain is something that receives it, and when it does that, it limits it to some extent. So the word reducer is fitting, but the word reducer can also mean like a coupling, like when you get ducting and you want to go from one size to the next size, you use a reducer to make it match up. So the brain is a reducer, so it brings consciousness into the body. So the scientist, David Chalmers is a scientist who's done a little bit of work on the problem of consciousness. He's brought it into vogue recently and trying to encourage scientists to solve it. Consciousness poses the most baffling problems in the science of the mind. There is nothing we know more intimately than conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain. So does anyone think consciousness is hard to explain? What is it that makes it hard to explain consciousness?
It's because it's something higher. You have higher consciousness, you have higher consciousness, you have lower consciousness. Yeah.
Where I'm going with this is that it's a certain worldview that has a problem with consciousness, namely reductive materialism. So the hard problem of consciousness, when philosophers and scientists talk about it, really what they mean is the problem in trying to explain consciousness in material terms as a product of matter. That's where the problem comes in. So to start off with, I thought I'd do a little breakdown of implications of the different theories. So I've broken it down into basically 3 different solutions to the problem of consciousness, or 3 different attempts to explain it. So on the left we have produced by the brain. In the middle we have consciousness doesn't exist, it's simply an illusion. And on the right we have consciousness is fundamental. Meaning, just like you have gravity and electrons, electromagnetic forces, and so many things in physics where they'll explain down to that level, but then they won't explain beyond that. That at that point, you've reached something that's fundamental. So on this theory, consciousness is fundamental. It's a basic building block of reality that exists all on its own. And it interacts with the other fundamental elements. So produced by the brain, I'm sure we're all familiar with those types of explanations. With that basic idea, it's sort of the default academic position these days, that we might not have the theory that explains it, but it must be the case that it's produced by the brain, or somehow or other produced by matter. So the implications of the different theories, I've listed a few things. If it's produced by the brain, if consciousness is produced by the brain, then there's no soul. We're just, the sense of self is an illusion. Really, we're a collection of atoms bound together for a time. If consciousness is produced by matter, then there's no free will. Some materialists try to get around that with something they call compatibilism. That's a theory of free will that says basically what they do is they change the definition of the word free will to say you feel like you have free will, but really you don't. It's sort of like an illusion that you go about your life making decisions, but really it's all determined by the laws of physics, and you were going to do the same thing anyway. Having free will, the technical way they define it is it means that you could have done differently, whereas if something's based on the laws of physics, it's fully deterministic. Of course, quantum physics kind of puts a spanner in the works and all of that, because quantum physics is not deterministic, but it's probabilistic. It's still based on chance. Free will is not. It's you have three categories. You have random, then you have free will, and then you have determined. And they're three different things. So free will is not deterministic, and it's not probabilistic. It's the third thing. So, it's like a person, they could act in a determined way, like somebody cuts them off on the motorway and get angry, that could be predictable, but they could also choose not to do that. That's the basic idea of free will, whereas if it's all produced by the brain, then you'd say even them choosing not to do it was ultimately just caused by their brain. And they didn't have a choice in it. They had the illusion of making a choice. And I would argue that saying it's produced by the brain lacks explanatory power, because we have a whole inner world of emotions and meaning and a sense of purpose and intentions. And if it's produced by the brain, then conscious states are identical to brain states, which means the experience of having an intention or a purpose is identical to a brain state, which means if somebody else had the same intention as you, they should have the same brain state. And if you could, that kind of takes all the magic out of it. It's no longer does it have any meaning or aboutness or intentionality. It just becomes the brain state. So in the middle we have consciousness is an illusion. This is an idea pushed mainly by a philosopher called Daniel Dennett. He's quite vocal about his atheism and his view on trying to explain consciousness. I heard him give a TED talk and I was quite amused because his TED talk was supposedly about consciousness, and he spent the whole time talking about how consciousness is, when he tells people what he does for a job, he has to tell them, the theories he likes to push, and he spends most of his time telling people that he's the expert and they don't, because everyone thinks they're an expert on consciousness. We all have a consciousness and we all experience things, so he has to go and try and tell them that actually they're not an expert and they don't know what they're talking about. But really what he goes on to say is one way he words it is consciousness is the brain's graphic user interface. It's an illusion. It's the illusion the brain creates in order to operate, because the stuff the brain does, the amount of information it processes and thinking it does, data integration and whatnot, is so complicated that it can't possibly be all integrated. So what it does is it creates a kind of user interface which just gets some of the information in an integrated fashion, and that makes it functional. So that's his theory. And I'd say there's two main problems we have with that theory. I put them as implications here. It leaves us with the question of, if consciousness is an illusion, what exactly is it that's under the illusion of consciousness? That might sound like a mind trick, but it's, illusion is something that happens to consciousness. So for consciousness to be an illusion, you've already presupposed consciousness. So I think we have a problem there. And the second problem with this theory is a world without consciousness is a world without consequences. So if consciousness didn't exist, then any way you could arrange matter in the universe would be identical, because there'd be no difference in the experience. Like when we talk about our actions having consequences, it's not like, oh, you smashed a glass, like, big deal. It's like, oh, now a person might get cut. The consequences are always in terms of an experience that it creates for ourselves or another person. So if there's no experiencer, if there's no consciousness, then there's no consequence. And then thirdly, we have consciousness as fundamental. So the implications I put for this one are, it means we have free will, because we are the conscious entity, and we are that thing which is neither deterministic nor probabilistic that can make decisions. I think that creating consciousness as fundamental has explanatory power. At one point, when they were making some progress with electricity and magnetism, were trying to explain it using what they knew about science, which was basically mechanics. So they tried to give mechanical explanations of how electricity was working, and none of them worked. And eventually they arrived at electricity being fundamental, and they came up with the physics that describes the way it behaves. So I think consciousness being given a status as fundamental has explanatory power in a similar way. And then of course that means we have moral truth, which I guess means if consciousness is produced by the brain, we're kind of left wondering whether moral values exist. Because why would we have an obligation to a collection of grey matter sitting in the skull? But if there's a conscious living entity inside, then we can have moral obligations. And of course this raises, if consciousness is fundamental, it kind of raises doubts for philosophical materialism, which is what Mike Wheaton was talking about in the video I played while we were waiting to start. So, is it even possible to have a satisfying reductionist explanation for consciousness? I'll just quickly play the video I clued up where Sam Harris explains this fact.
Is that any explanation we get about consciousness, I mean, let's just say we open the back of the book of nature and we get the right answer about consciousness, and it turns out that you need exactly 10,000 information processing units of a certain character. They have to be wired in a certain way. They have to be firing at a certain hertz. And just lo and behold, that is what gives you consciousness. And if you change any of those parameters, well, then the lights go out. Let's say we knew that to be true. It still wouldn't explain the emergence of consciousness in a way that is intuitively graspable. It still would seem like a miracle. And that's not the way most, or really any satisfying scientific explanation works out. When I give you an explanation for any higher level property, the fluidity of water or the brittleness of glass, in terms of its micro constituents, well, then that explanation actually does run through and conserves your intuitions about how things function at a lower level so as to appear as they do on a higher level.
So there's a lot of debate that goes on the subject, and some argue that it's not even possible to have a materialistic explanation for consciousness, because at one point we didn't have an explanation for electricity or for how biology makes bodies function, or how reproduction occurs in cells. But science at the time at least knew what an explanation would look like, that it was conceivable that an explanation could come, and they knew the kind of thing they were expecting it to be. Whereas with consciousness, there's no reason to even think it's possible to have an explanation, and there's no clue what it would even look like. Like, they've offered various attempts, like one scientist was suggesting that when the brain waves synchronize, you get something like 40 hertz. That's what creates consciousness, or some say that certain complexity of information integration, then you get consciousness. So on that theory, if the hardware that computers were built out of was rival human brains in complexity, then computers could be conscious because they could integrate as much information as we do. Does anybody think that's plausible? So there's good reason to believe we couldn't even possibly have a satisfying explanation for consciousness on materialism. And I guess you guys can see the name. some biological cells magic and then consciousness. So, can we see that trick again? One last thing on that point. Like he explained in that little clip I played how, like we know what makes glass brittle. Like it's got an amorphous structure, so the atoms inside can't slide past one another. So when force is applied, all they can do is crack. So we know exactly what makes glass brittle, and it runs all the way down to the bottom. The whole thing makes sense, like physics explains atoms and physics and atoms kind of are the same level of explanation, and they explain chemistry, and chemistry explains biology, and all the way up it's very satisfying. But as soon as you get to consciousness, it's like it doesn't really follow from the bottom. So now I'm going to move on to a kind of design argument, because the question is, if consciousness is produced by matter at a certain level of complexity, then consciousness pops out, then you have to reach that level of complexity without any conscious intervention. You can't have any intention behind it. So that's why this point's relative. So can order emerge from chaos? Can complexity be produced by blind physical forces? If matter comes first, then blind physical forces must be responsible for incredible order and complexity. We know, however, that a conscious mind can, with intention, arrange matter in complex and sophisticated ways. So here I'll give one example. So science explains symmetries and patterns by appealing to greater and deeper symmetries and patterns. I'll give one example. So those marbles in that, they're in the bottom of the bowl. Does anybody think those marbles were arranged in that symmetrical pattern by somebody, or did they just naturally take that shape?
Naturally.
So because of the shape of the bowl, the marbles all go to the bottom, and because of the shape of the marbles, they all fit together nicely. So you can explain this with a technical term in physics, which is called symmetry. They use the word symmetry a lot. They're always talking about symmetry. It's like, so a marble, a sphere has more symmetry than any other shape. What that means is there's basically infinite positions you can put it in with it still being identical. So if you swap out any one of those marbles with another marble, it's still identical. And if you turn any of the marbles any amount, you still have an identical pattern. And the reason is because all the marbles are perfectly round and they're all the same. So that's explained by going back to the marble factory. The marbles were made to have that symmetry in a factory because people wanted round marbles. But then we have other interesting things, like we have why are there so many carbon atoms in the universe, and why are all the carbon atoms the same? And it gets even weirder because in organic chemistry and living systems, all the carbon molecules are homochiral, which is a technical term. Basically, the molecules can be left-handed or right-handed. So all the, I don't know if they're left or right, but say all the carbon molecules in chemistry and human living systems are left-handed. And they have no idea how to produce that in the lab. They try to imitate organic chemistry in the lab. They produce a whole mess of things, and then they have to purify it out to get what they need, and it's a whole process. So it's a serious question of why are all the carbon atoms left-handed, which are found in living organisms, and why there's so many identical carbon atoms in the universe. But if you just take that as fundamental, if you just accept, oh, the carbon atoms were here, you can explain a lot with that. Just so with the laws of physics, like the ancients talked about the order of the cosmos and how amazing it is that the planets and stars were kept in perfect orbits, moved in an orderly, predictable fashion. It was actually a religious belief that had them investigating, because the mainly Christian idea that the universe has order imbued into it, so it's intelligible, and we have a brain, we've been gifted with a brain that's capable of comprehending it. So they started investigating all these things, and gradually that shifted to a more atheistic reductionism. And but when they go back to these explanations, when they explain all these, the way gravity works and whatnot, they take it back to a level of explaining like laws of physics, like gravity, the strength gravity has, and other laws of physics, and the relationship they have to one another and to the masses of atoms. So, you know, the mass of carbon atoms and the way gravity acts on it, and so on. If you change any of these things by a fraction, then you wouldn't have life as we know it. So the materialist scientists claim they can explain life in a reductionist way by appealing to the laws of physics and the properties of matter. But really all they've done is appeal to deeper symmetries and patterns, which require more explaining than what they've used them to explain. So they've actually created an even bigger problem, but they've sort of done it in such a way that a lot of people haven't noticed. It's like you have some nice rhetoric and you say, oh, look, we can explain that. You give an explanation. Like I have a toddler, he's nearly 4, and I'm quite philosophical, so I always enjoy seeing how long the questions go. You know, kids always ask a question, why is there a fence there? Oh, no, it's like temporary fence got put up for a festival or something. Oh, because they wanted a fence there. Oh. So I found usually the questions stop when it's something he can't understand or when they give a teleological answer. Teleological means somebody wanted it that way, it's the intent behind it. But so the scientists satisfy people's questions by giving the laws of physics, and people don't ask any further for some reason. But why are the laws of physics so finely tuned to create things the way we see them is a very good question. And I'd say consciousness, the conscious intent, teleology, a mind arranging them is a much better explanation. So now quantum physics. The wave functions in quantum physics is broken by the observer. This shows that consciousness is separate from matter. So probably everybody's heard the double slit experiment. And basically the purport of it is matter behaves differently if you're watching it to if you're not watching it. And they tried to say, oh, is it just if you put a camera there? So they put a camera there that threw the data away, and it behaved as if nobody was watching it. And they had the same camera there and look at the data, and it behaves as if somebody's watching it. So it's really clear that it's an observer that does this. And quantum physics, like Richard Feynman claims that nobody understands quantum physics, and if anybody understands it, it's Richard Feynman. So for him to say that means something. He's a really phenomenal scientist. Trying to think how much to go into the quantum physics. I don't know it so well myself, but the wave function gets broken down. So, and they talk about that there's probability theory. So you have the decay of a radioactive isotope, and you'll have, say, like you have the half-life of it, which means after this many years, half of the atoms will have decayed. But there's no way of telling which ones will. And if you're just watching one, you've got no idea when it's going to decay. You have a probability when it's going to decay. So they say you have a 12-hour period, and the chances are after 12 hours it will decay. It could still be there after 12 hours. And if you wait 6 hours, there's a 50% chance it will have decayed. But unless you actually look at it, you don't know if it's decayed. So the question is that they think that it could be in two states at once. And Schrodinger came up with a thought experiment to describe this. If you had a gun hooked up to a detector of a quantum process and a cat inside a box, then would the cat either be dead or alive, or would it both be dead or alive until you opened the box and found out? And it's just a thought experiment, but it shows how wacky, I think he came up with the idea to show how wacky quantum physics is. But the point here is that the observer has to break down the wave function. So for all we know, as far as it's understood, that isotope hasn't broken down, or it's in both states at once until somebody looks at it. So the problem is it's just sitting in a goop of probabilities until somebody actually looks at it. And once somebody looks at it, then it's either one state or the other. And one analogy that's given is it's like somebody's studying for an exam. The more they study, the higher their chance of getting a good grade. But if they never sit the exam, those probabilities mean nothing. So there actually has to be a time when the exam happens and there's a mark in order for you to talk about probabilities of them getting certain grades. If there's no exam, then there's no chance of them getting any grades. So the wave function has to be broken down at some point. And then once they sit the exam, it's gone from probabilities to an exact thing. They have an exact grade at that point. And there's now a 100% chance that that's the grade that they'll get because they've already got it, and 0% of the others. And so the Princeton Engineering Anomalies research was something that was started by an engineering student who went to his professor at Princeton and said, I'd like to research if people's minds can affect the processes of a random event generator. And the professor, not being in a philosophy or anything department, didn't have any reason not to worry about it because he wasn't studying minds, so he didn't have to worry about that can't be possible or that wrong conclusion can't be had. So he just went ahead and did it, and they found that human minds can influence random event generators. So that wasn't really what anyone was expecting, and so they continued to do more research and made more and more machines, and made them as random as possible, and did more and more trials, and they were consistently finding that people could influence the random event generator. So they do it with quantum things, or they do it with mechanical things like marbles falling and have a chance of falling one side. So somebody stands and they have to try to will the marbles to fall one side and not the other. All right, I've got a quick video and play that version. Save it.
This machine does 200 flips per second. When left unattended, it performs in a statistically normal way. And over time, it approximates a chance mean of 100. But when an operator is present, wishing for the output to be higher or lower, the output deviates very slightly from the chance expectation. The effect shown in these devices is small. Only a few flips in 10,000 are influenced by the operator. But those few are working contemporary physics can explain. In fact, it's not limited to these electronic devices. The Pear Lab has explored many sources of random event generation.
A little shift to right. And compounding the results across all of our experiments, all of the time we've been operating, you then come out saying that the results you find in this composite database are unlikely by chance to better than 1 part in 10 to the 12th. That's 1 part in a trillion. This is far more stringent than any science experiment I'm aware of requires for its validation.
So to me, that research is quite interesting, and it suggests that the mind is fundamental and can influence matter. And some think that the way we control our brains might have something to do with the quantum process. I suspect if that student that wanted to do that research was in another department, they would have got told, no, you can't do that, because that went on at Princeton for years. They shut it down recently, but they got a lot of flack because nobody wanted those results. Materialism is really running things in the academy. So consciousness, we know it with more certainty than we know anything. So that's another reason why Daniel Dennett's attempt to try to tell people that consciousness is an illusion is kind of odd. there was one debate I heard where, I was like 100 years ago, I can't remember who it was, but he was saying that he wrote back to the other guy saying, if someone could give me an argument that establishes that I can't see, should I accept it even though I couldn't refute it? So although somebody might be able to argue that we can't see, and we might not have a refutation of the argument, we know we can see better than we know the laws of logic. So the argument won't. It's based on premises which are less obvious than our conscious experience. So, like Descartes went through a mental process of trying to figure out what things he couldn't doubt. He got all the way down to the point of saying he couldn't doubt the existence of his mind and his experience. So we can doubt the existence of our body. We could. There's the brain and the back problem in philosophy. We could worry that maybe nobody in our life exists and none of this is real, that we're deceived in all we perceive, that we're just in a petri dish in some mad scientist lab who's manipulating us to think that we're having a real life. You can doubt back to that level, but you can't doubt that you have a mind, because your mind is the thing that's doing the doubting. Of course, we have good reason to believe that we're not brains in the vat, because of that's also self-evident to us. The nature of our experience of our lives tells us that this world is real and the people in it are real. So I've got a few quotes from John Lennox and Thomas Nagel to show materialism, when applied to consciousness, is a showstopper because it creates a problem for materialistic science. To do science, you need to trust your brain. And if your brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process, why trust it? So Thomas Nagel, who's a famous contemporary philosopher, says, but if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Does everyone follow that? So what he's saying is evolutionary naturalism depends on our scientific convictions. And the premise behind that is our scientific convictions depend on us trusting our brains. But if our brains are a product of evolution, of a mindless, unguided process, natural selection selects for functional advantage. And there's no reason that the ability to do abstract math is maybe even a survival disadvantage. You can imagine, the cavemen sitting around and one guy's busy doing abstract math and the other guys are out hunting or running away from the predator that comes in, and the guy's too busy doing math to realize that the predator's coming and he gets eaten by the bear or something. So there's no reason why evolution would select for us to have brains which are capable of understanding science. So there's no reason on evolution to trust our brains to give us an accurate picture of the world. It's one way C.S. Lewis put it is it's to think that a brain which is a product of a process like this can give you an accurate picture of reality. It's like thinking you could disturb milk, the contents of a milk glass, and create a map. It's a random process. So if there's just random neurons firing in a brain, why should they tell us anything about the world outside in a cohesive way? Does that kind of make sense now? It's a bit of an abstract idea. But whereas Christians are kind of the ones that drove scientific discovery because they had this conviction that we have a brain that's given to us by God that's capable of comprehending reality, and the world has a natural law imbued into it, a kind of order that's comprehensible. So John Lennox says, science requires the workings of the world are rationally and mathematically intelligible. And that assumption originated in religion, and the idea that the rational and mathematical intelligibility was imbued into it by a divine mind. So can machines ever be conscious? What do you think? Anyone think maybe machines could be conscious one day? It's certainly an interesting thing to ponder. There's a contemporary philosopher, John Searle, who thinks that they can't. And he breaks it down with some technical philosophy into semantics and syntax. So syntax is what computers do. They push symbols around. It's symbol manipulation. Whereas semantics is what we do. We understand an idea. So if you tell somebody to go to the store and buy some milk, they're not manipulating symbols and following an algorithm in order to figure out what they need to do and how to do it. They comprehend what you're asking, and then they comprehend all the other things involved, and they just go and do it. And the interesting thing about cognition is it's unified. So when you understand a mathematical concept, for example, there's a single thing that happens, there's a single act of understanding. Whereas what computers do is a whole process of ones and zeros, and it's all splayed out. And when they go to carry out a task, they're just manipulating symbols the whole time. And if you introduce one error, the program becomes inconsistent, and it can no longer execute its task. So the old AI used to be incredibly dumb. They'd train it to recognize a shoe, and that took heaps of coding, and hours and hours, and then they turned the shoe upside down, and the program could no longer recognize it. So now with AI, they do machine learning, and machines are better at humans in a lot of ways. They want to start bringing in AI to do passport identification, because they figured out that humans are actually not very good at matching a passport photo to a face, because the people look quite different on different days. And people that know the person can do it very well, but the people are particularly bad when it's an ethnicity they're not familiar with. They're even worse at identifying, but machines are actually better at humans at this kind of thing now. And of course, when it gets to the level of accusing somebody of fraud, they still bring people in to look at the photos before they convict somebody of passport fraud. But still, the computers are not comprehending what they're doing. They're just executing an algorithm. It's still just syntax. There's no active understanding, whereas what we do is semantics. So John Searle argues on that basis that computers can never become conscious. And the thought experiment that he devised to prove this, it's a very famous argument now, is called the Chinese room experiment. And it states that you imagine a room with a person in it and a book full of rules, and so they get handed a string of Chinese symbols, which is somebody asking a question in Chinese, and they flip through the book and look at the symbols and follow the algorithm and figure out which Chinese symbols to pass back out the door. And they can, in this way, have a whole conversation in Chinese and even answer the question, can you understand Chinese, by saying back to them, of course I can, don't ask such stupid questions. But still, has anybody, supposing I was the person sitting in the room, have I understood anything of the conversation that was going back and forth in Chinese? And there's been various responses to this argument, like, well, the room is conscious of having a conversation in Chinese. And that's a little bit of a strange one, there's bits of paper in the room and things getting shuffled around, and somehow, the room is conscious. Or you have a group of people doing this where there's an algorithm and people push bits of paper back and forth, and that results in answering questions in Chinese. So is there a collective consciousness among all those people that understands having a conversation in Chinese? Does anybody think that there's any Chinese comprehension going on in such a thought experiment? So I think it's pretty clear to see that we could, I could do that and not understand anything of the conversation. So on that basis, John Searle argues that machines can never become conscious. I mentioned earlier that some claim computers can become conscious if their hardware mimics human brains. So the theory here is that consciousness is a product of a certain level of neural complexity and information integration. So if right now computer hardware that carries out AI is nowhere near as complex as the brain. So they argue that if they made computers more complex so they can integrate more information, then you'd have a complex conscious computer. Some would say you wouldn't want a conscious computer because then you'd have to say, oh, is it all right if I turn you off? And that's not the kind of mess we want to get into. It's kind of nice having computers just serving us in a slave fashion without having to worry about their rights. Like imagine if they wanted to send some robots to Mars, maybe for a while they'd get away with it, and eventually the AI rights activists would come in and they'd have to make sure they bring them back. And so another argument against computers being conscious is if, say if consciousness is identical to brain states, if states of consciousness are identical to brain states, then if you could download your consciousness onto a sufficiently complex computer, would you become the computer? If you left your body, if your body died, but there was a computer that had all of your personality downloaded onto it in complex hardware, would that become you? And I don't think it's clear that it would. So now we're moving on to qualia and the zombie argument. So qualia is a technical philosophical term that refers to, I heard it described as subjective qualitative experience. So interestingly, in science, they don't have a definition of consciousness which they're satisfied with. Does anyone find it odd that consciousness would be a difficult thing to define? For me, it's quite obvious. Consciousness is the experience. We experience various things, and the experience itself is the act of consciousness. But the reason why they don't have a satisfactory scientific definition is because they don't have anything that they can measure. So you don't want to say a temperature as you can describe it in the scientific mathematical terms because you can quantify it. So many things you can quantify. But consciousness, they can't say what it is, so they're not happy with any of the definitions. And there's no definition you could come up with that you could then go and tell, like, how do you tell if a computer's conscious? So I'd argue that we tell if something's conscious using our internal ability to apprehend truth. So the same way we look out and we know that there's a real world outside our mind, we're not brains in the back, that same faculty that tells us torturing babies are bad and various other facts about reality, but that same faculty tells us that animals are conscious and they experience pain, and so on. So, John Searle made this point. He said, I have a pet dog. He likes calling his dogs after famous philosophers. It's fun for him. I can't remember what Turk or something. And he says he looks in his eyes and you can tell he's conscious. He's got his eyes moving around, he's smelling, he's behaving, he's conscious. It's obvious. And you look at a computer, like, my laptop's obviously not conscious, and you have a robot, like they get AI that can animate itself and talk, and it's clearly not conscious. There's something different about it to the experience we get from interacting with a dog or a person. So I talked about the problem defining consciousness when I was defining qualia. So the zombie argument goes that it's a thought experiment that asks you to imagine a world identical to the one we're in, where there's people just like us. So a philosophical zombie is not a Hollywood zombie. It's a different thing. A philosophical zombie is identical to us. It's just nobody's home. There's no conscious experience inside that body. So philosophically, it's conceivable that such a thing could exist, and there's no way to prove that somebody is or isn't a philosophical zombie because their brain takes in data, it responds. If a philosophical zombie got stabbed, they'd wince in pain and pull away and so on. They behave exactly as if they were suffering pain, except there's nobody home suffering. there's no one experiencing it. So the argument goes that say on evolutionary terms, evolution selects for functional advantage, and there's no functional advantage to being conscious, to having the experience of qualia. So there's no reason why evolution would select for it. It might still arise as a coincidence, like something that happened to arise but didn't have any negative consequences, so it hung around. But natural selection wouldn't select for it. There's no reason why a group of apes that experienced qualia would be any better at surviving than a group of apes that responded to all the same sensory input in all the same ways, but wasn't conscious of experiencing any of it. So the argument built on top of this is that since consciousness can exist separate from matter, since matter can exist without consciousness, therefore consciousness is not identical to matter. It's something different. And then the other argument that's given based on qualia is there's no sensible way to explain, say, the experience of yellow based on the laws of physics. So I spoke earlier about how we can explain, say, the fragility of glass based on its molecular structure, and so many other things we can explain. But the experience of yellow cannot be explained by the frequency of light waves. And there's an interesting thought experiment related to this, which I'll play.
Contemporary Australian philosopher Frank Jackson presents us with the thought experiment of Mary, a woman who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, learning everything via a black and white television. While locked in this room, Mary becomes a neurophysicist specializing in the science of color. She learns everything there is to know about light, optics, the physics of color, and how it affects our sensory organs, but she has never seen it for herself. So here's the question. When Mary finally walks out of the room and sees color for the first time, has Mary learned something new? Jackson devised this thought experiment as an argument against reductive physicalism, because, Jackson says, the qualitative experience of seeing a color, say red, isn't the same as knowing facts about red. If everything could be explained in terms of the physical, then when Mary finally saw red, it wouldn't have contributed to her understanding at all. It wouldn't have told her anything that she didn't already know. Thanks, Thought Bubble. What's missing from a physicalist...
Did everyone follow that?
Pretty much.
So that's kind of a similar thing to the zombie argument in a sense, because it's kind of showing how consciousness is a separate thing. I guess it's a slightly different argument. So yeah, this problem of qualia is quite substantial, I'd say, and of course it pervades a lot of things. And there's no reason to think that the experience, like, say the taste of pineapple. My wife made that slide actually, it's interesting because pineapple is one of the examples that people give. The taste of pineapple, like, you can't say it's a material thing. It's an experience that occurs in the mind, and the mind is arguably not material. So, if you want to say the taste of pineapple is material, then, how big is it? Where is it located? Right? I guess you could give it a duration. You could situate it in time, but so moving on, is intention and comprehension non-material by necessity? Consciousness has the quality of aboutness. So this is something I've taken a while to get my head around and listen to a lot of intellectuals talking about. It's John Lennox talks about this. He has a lot of debates. He's a mathematician and a Christian, and he's really into philosophy too. So he sat down with one of his reductionist debate opponents for dinner and asked him to explain the menu based only on the matter with which the menu is produced. And the guy read out what he wants for dinner and was like, how did you get that from the menu? Oh, it says it right there. It's like, can you explain that based on the atoms? So what we have going on there is sort of an abstract concept to try to understand. But like a computer, you can punch a code into it. Like you get a piece of paper with ones and zeros. It's a physical thing. You put it into a machine that reads the ones and zeros and carries out a program, and you can edit the ones and zeros, and the program would behave differently. And all of that is material. One argument that was used, C.S. Lewis was making this argument about our ability to, this kind of argument about consciousness being non-material because we can perceive truth. And somebody's response was, well, you can stand on a scale, and the dial moves and it tells you your weight. And it's accurate, it gives you the right information, even though the scale isn't conscious, it's just a mechanical thing. And C.S. Lewis didn't actually respond to that, and he got a bit dejected, feeling like he was defeated in the debate, and went on to stop doing apologetics and focus on other writing projects. But I've heard other people comment on that and thought about it a lot myself, that there's a few things going on with the standing on the scale. One is that number that the scale reads is only intelligible to a person. I mean, you could translate that into a machine that then translates that into, knowing the weight, and you could go and get a machine to get you an equal weight to show that it knows what you're talking about and so on. But the machine's still just following algorithms. It's just symbol manipulation. It's not, the machine hasn't actually understood any of it. It's only people that can make abstractions, that we can take the idea of 100 kilos and say that's something true of a lot of objects. And it's people that programmed that scale, calibrated it to give you an accurate weight. Without somebody coming and tuning that scale wouldn't give you correct information. Which comes to another point, which is a computer is kind of like a formal system of logic. You have a formal system of logic means it's closed. They've devised the rules, formalized it, and it's a closed system of logic. And hopefully it's consistent and gives us truth. So, originally, like a calculator or something like that, it's a formal system of logic. You punch in numbers and you get precise answers, and it's following all these rules. But the thing is that a calculator cannot prove that it's consistent. All it can do is execute its algorithm. There's no way for the program itself to prove that it is consistent. And if something is inconsistent, if a calculator can tell you that 1 + 1 = 1, or any other inconsistency that you might have in an algorithm, then the results are devastating. You can take an inconsistent set of logic and use it to prove anything. Somebody once challenged Bertrand Russell, can you prove that you're the Pope based on 1 + 1 = 1? And Bertrand Russell proceeded to do just that. He said, okay, suppose there's a room with just two people in it, myself and the Pope. Since 1 + 1 = 1, there's only one person in the room. Therefore, I'm the Pope. So that's just one example of the problem you have when you have inconsistent logic. Whereas if our brains are just computers, which is a common popular belief, then we have no way of knowing if we're consistent. Whereas, of course, we can make mistakes, and some people are certainly inconsistent. That's generally a mental illness. What we can do is we can study a formal system of logic, and we can derive from it a truth which we know to be true, but which can't be proven true, but using the algorithm of the system of logic. So there's a lot of examples given to make this point, and some of them are incredibly complicated. But one simple one is if you had a piece of software that could that could add numbers to equal 20. It could add an odd number and an even number to equal 20, and then let's see if I remember it right. And then you could try asking the algorithm, can you add 3 odd numbers together to equal 20? And the algorithm won't be able to tell you. the algorithm could go through all the numbers up to 20 and all the numbers above 20 and keep going from infinity, searching for combinations that will answer the question of whether you can use 3 odd numbers to add up to 20. And it will never arrive at an answer. But we can look at that system of logic, and based on our faith and the rules of that system of logic, so that's how it goes. People study a system of logic, they formalize it, and based on those rules of logic, in every single case, there's something you can prove to be true based on your faith in the laws of logic, of that system of logic, but which that system itself, as a closed system, cannot prove to be true. And then you say, oh, that's easy. You add another piece of logic to that system of logic, which proves that thing to be true, problem solved. But you do that, and you've created a new system of logic. It's not the same as the old one, it's not identical. And in that new system of logic, there's always another thing you can prove to be true based on that system of logic by standing outside of it and looking at it, but which you can't prove to be true within that system of logic. So this is called Gödel's theorem. It's a very famous mathematical proof that Gödel came up with. He proved that you can never have a mathematical system that can prove everything. Like you can't. That they devised a lot of mathematical closed systems where they formalized a lot of the rules of geometry and different other mathematical rules. And there was the hope of scientists for a long time that you could formalize math and logic, and they even wanted to formalize philosophy to the point where you just follow a formula and you have truth. And Bertrand Russell and some of his contemporaries were trying to do this, and Wittgenstein proved to them that it's not possible. And Gödel's theorem also proved to them it's not possible. I think he was around the same time. And they were dejected and kind of gave up. But it's so you can't arrive at truth based on just a closed system of logic. You always need a conscious entity, a human mind, to decipher the truth and work out if something's consistent and add to it if needed. So this, to me, is another evidence that the mind is not a computer and it's something else, because computers are a formal system of logic. Did everyone follow that? Any questions? It's pretty technical stuff, right? I've tried to sort of digest it and make it understandable, so I'm sort of getting near the end, which is good timing because it's 7. So Benjamin Leibotz's thought timing research a possible objection. So you've probably heard of you might not know him by name, but the guy measured brainwaves and he could detect an action potential before a muscle movement. So he'd get people, strap people in, something like that, and ask them to, at a random time, move their finger, and he could detect the action potential of the finger movement, but he was interested in timing it. So he'd have them look at like a clock or something that was moving and note down the exact place the clock was when they decided to move their finger. So it was arguably an act of free will. They were choosing to move their finger. It was volitional. And he found that there was a delay, that their reported time when they reported experiencing wanting to move their finger was after an action potential had already surfaced to start moving the finger. So he used that to argue against free will. And actually, I don't know if he did argue against that. I think he actually, other people used that to argue against free will. He actually was clever and continued his research. And he asked people to decide to move their finger and then decide not to. So decide you're going to move your finger and then veto it, and don't actually move your finger. I mean, you kind of wonder who's paying these people to come up with this stuff. But anyway, it gives us some interesting philosophy to talk about. Meanwhile, children are starving in Africa, and this guy's Can
I mention something about free will that I learned about in one of my graduate math classes? You've probably heard about this philosophical concept. It's like this. It starts with the letter L, and it's like demon. I don't remember like the exact word, but basically like this freaks me out. Like every time I think about this, like mathematically, it just makes so much sense, and like but basically, imagine you knew every single factor that like acts on every single factor. So like let's say like there's like a leaf falling and like you knew exactly like, you know, the direction of the wind and like gravity and the airflow, the air resistance, just like absolutely 100% of the factors that come into play when this leaf is falling. And let's say like you also knew like the starting position. So therefore you could basically say with like certainty how the leaf would fall. Like as long as given a starting position and like all of the factors. And so since everything is a consequence of previous events, and then there's all these factors acting on just things that happen, therefore like as long as you have a beginning, which you can really help, you know, like being born or anything. Everything just like from a starting point, like everything is kind of like
type of body
predetermined in that way.
And the environment we get and the experiences we have all determine our brain state, and then our actions as a result of that appear to be free will, but actually they're determined by
all those factors, like
so that I'm not sure what the term is you're referring to. Now I'm nervous as a math student, you know. That's based on classical physics. So classical physics for a long time was heading in the direction of determinism. That, you know, like if you knew the exact amount of gunpowder used, the trajectory, you could predict exactly where the cannonball would land. And that works for classical physics. That describes large bodies, but that all came undone with quantum physics. So with quantum physics, all you have is basically a group of probabilities. A wave of probabilities, so that you don't really know what's going to happen, and it's not deterministic. And like the Princeton anomalies research showed that a human brain can influence a random event generator slightly in one direction. And so some people use quantum physics to argue for free will, and some people object to that, understandably. And one of the objections is if free will were influencing a quantum process, that would be violating the probability laws that govern that quantum process. I don't think that's a very good argument though, because the probability laws say that any number of things can happen. So, you know, like with random things, you do a small sample and you get outliers, you do a large enough sample and you should reach 50-50 or whatever is predicted by the random process. But you can always get outliers, so there's always the possibility for the human mind to influence things. And so potentially the brain is influenced by quantum processes which are controlled by the mind or the conscious entity which inhabits the body. Leibert went on to do it with his experiment, and he asked people to think about moving their finger and then veto it. And what he found is there was an action potential to move their finger, even though they vetoed it, but there was no action potential to cancel the movement. So Leibert came up with this term free one, which is actually somewhat consistent with Bhagavad Gita philosophy. So according to Bhagavad Gita, we're kind of pushed around by the modes of material nature. So there are forces that act on us somewhat against our will, and we can choose to just be carried along by them. So, you know, like you get a speeding ticket and you say, oh, I was just going the same speed as everybody else. And I think maybe in some countries or states you get away with that. If everyone's going the same speed, then you don't get a ticket. Not in New Zealand. But you know, it's like that. You know, like you have a bunch of friends that are drinking, and you end up drinking too, or you know, you hang out with angry people, and you end up getting angry, or and so on, right? We with the modes of material nature push on us, but free won't. With this ability to say no. So animals, what's it said that what differentiates humans from animals is we have the ability to question why we're here, what we're doing, and to do something different. Whereas an animal, they're hungry and they're just running around sniffing. Whereas a human can say, oh, I'm fasting today, it's good for my health. Or I'm fasting today for spiritual reasons or whatnot. I'm not going to eat today, and they just don't get worried. Whereas an animal, put food in front of them and eat. The animal doesn't have the reasoning faculty which is able to override their animalistic desires. Of course, a lot of humans do not exercise that. And some people like to say that people who don't exercise that are animals. And I think you can make a case for that. You know, what makes somebody human might not be having a human body, it might be behaving like a human being. So that's Leibniz's experience. There's a few other objections. That's the one I gave already, and the second one is he's basically saying that people were asked to move their finger at a random time. So they probably waited, you know, there's the ebb and flow of brain waves all the time, and they just waited till one rose and took that one to decide to move their finger. So the fact that an action potential happened and they decided, oh, I'll move my finger now, doesn't mean that free will doesn't exist. It just means they happened to decide to go with the brain wave that came up at that time. That's the same thing. All right, so I've gone through all my slides. 17 I did well. Any questions?
A lot of this is very current as far as this current trend that's growing in regards to philosophy that's called the law of attraction, isn't it?
Oh yeah, is that growing again? It came out like 10 years ago, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it really is. Yeah. But it sort of proves it, doesn't it? It proves it.
Yeah, well, some people state that the universe is always trying to get you what you want, and whatever you're focusing on, it's all it can interpret for what you want. So it gives you whatever you're focusing on. And you could find some truth to that based on Bhagavad Gita, you know, which
Sure.
I mean, it doesn't mean if you meditate on a sports car and imagine you've got a sports car that you can have a sports car. They're not pushing that idea anymore, are they?
No, well, of course. No, I mean, it's not that.
You know, they used to tell people like, visualize, and the more detail you can add, you know, picture yourself pulling the gear.
Sure, yeah. Well, it's not that simple, is it? I mean, the vibration has to match.
Yeah.
The vibrations.
But they're definitely like what you meditate on has a huge impact on your consciousness, and you'll find more of those things, and more of those things will come into your life. This is not a materialistic theory, obviously, but
No.
it's sort of a yeah.
So if we are like, there's a supreme controller, which I buy into, then we're many like Krishna, supreme controller,
Yeah.
and then as parts and parcels, we're many Krishnas, right?
Yeah.
So we have such an another.
Yeah.
So of course we have his capabilities to a degree.
Yeah.
And creation is.
Yeah, or the other way around. You take our, like I said before, how our consciousness is the one thing we can't deny, our conscious experience. So it's quite funny that some scientists go on to try to deny it because they're actually using the consciousness to do science.
Yeah. Yes.
So you could build up from that if we're conscious entities, then you just imagine the same thing on a larger scale, the supreme version of that.
True.
Right. What was your question?
I just you're on an even example, and there's a very, very simple way to program a computer to know the definition. The definition is very, very, very straightforward. So.
No, but it doesn't comprehend it.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, maybe we'll comprehend it, but you could totally program that.
Yeah, I mean,
not difficult in any shape or form.
It's kind of hard because when I was preparing for some of the stuff I was listening to is old, and computer sciences have moved in leaps and bounds in a very short amount of time. AI is progressing at incredible paces. And I think AI is capable of doing incredible things, but it's still not, there's no semantics, it's not aware of any of it. So if you have a computer that can speak perfect English, it doesn't understand any of the ideas that are contained in the words. Was that?
Yeah.
Any other questions or anything I should talk about more? Is it too technical? I thought I was worried I had forgot too many technical ideas and I'm just going to be right. Talking too fast and nobody will grasp it.
I thought it was very interesting, it was very technical.
Yeah.
And my mind easily distracted, so my mind will just move away from what you're saying, and I have to try and look it back. But like if you recorded that talk, I'll probably listen to it a dozen times, and I'll keep listening.
Oh right,
to it,
yeah, I'm
and
gonna
I'll
put
get
out my YouTube
Well,
channel.
Yeah, thank you.
I think YouTube's becoming a big thing. I want to start using it. Well, it's 7:15, so I guess is that right? Is that what time we have done? Is that what time we go then?
Oh, yeah, I think it is.
Okay, right. That's the first time I've ever been talk to you.
I really appreciate your talk. I just wanted to say thank you. Because I feel like as a mathematician, people always like don't understand like what advanced math is, and I feel like now the people in the room will have like a slightly better idea of what advanced math is. Like it is a system of logic, like it is like a system of rules and proofs, where like the average person I interact with that is not a mathematician will be like, oh yeah, so like what's the square root of like 1,032,000? Like, you know, just like okay, that's not what we do in advanced math. Like there's no advanced math class, we're just like
It's kind of like
the prompt is to be a calculator.
it's like formalized logic.
Yeah.
Like if you had formalized philosophy, it would be the same thing, right?